What's going on, everybody? This is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries, and in today's video, we are going to be talking about the new Pope, Pope Leo XIV. We are going to be talking about the future of the Roman Catholic Church and what this means for the rest of the world. So, in the past few days, after the passing of Pope Francis, who was the first Jesuit Pope in history, he was an Argentinian Pope from Latin America. He was a promoter of liberation theology, of globalism, and of the Interfaith Movement. These are all themes that we're going to touch upon today. Now we have the new Pope who has taken the name Pope Leo XIV. And this is an American cardinal by the name of Cardinal Robert Prevost. And he has now been elected as the supreme pontiff of the Roman Catholic Church, to use their own terminology. So this is a momentous event today, and as we're going to be talking about today, this is an event that evangelical Protestants, evangelicals and or Protestants should be taking note of and paying attention to, not because of we have any sympathy for Roman Catholic theology, but this is a momentous moment in history that could have really long-lasting implications for the rest of the world. The Roman Catholic Church is still, quote, the largest denomination in the world, even though I always insist that it is not a true Christian denomination. It is a false church. It is really what the Bible calls Mystery Babylon. It is Babylonian paganism with the outward veneer of Christianity around it. And some people think that's conspiracy theory. Some people think that that is historical fallacy, but that is the truth. And that is the truth that has been documented by Christians over the many centuries who have witnessed against the false theology of Rome. But so we're going to be talking about all of this today. We're going to be talking about who is this man, who Robert Prevost, who has taken the name of Leo XIV, who is the man who has just been the new Pope. And then the other thing that I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be covering, I really want to cover the history of the Vatican from from the end of World War II and really come up to the modern day. So really the modern Vatican, the post World War II world Vatican. So this is the Vatican of the past 70 to 80 years, essentially. And we're going to, because I really believe that in order to understand what's going to happen in the future, we have to be able to have enough understanding of history and of the long term trajectory and trends of Roman Catholicism of the past 7 years. Because it's kind of similar to how stockbrokers, when they try to project the future of the markets, they have to look back to what the market has been doing in the past weeks and months and maybe even years. And so for us to understand the future of what is going to happen for the future of Roman Catholicism and even the world, we have to go deeper than just the biographical information of the man who became Pope. We're going to talk about that today, but we need to really we need to paint the big picture today, and that's going to allow us to understand the future trajectory of Roman Catholicism and by extension the world. And that's really why I want to cover this today. And when we get to the end of this video, I'm going to make some predictions for the future. I'm not claiming they are any type of prophetic or divinely inspired predictions. They are just my predictions based on my study of history and current events. And I'm even going to speculate how this may tie in to Bible prophecy. So stay tuned till the end of the video, guys. There's going to be a lot of history in this video. This one's going to be a real kicker. So we'll see how it goes. So I'm going to start today with the biographical information of Pope Leo XIV. And then I'm going to proceed to go into that history of Roman Catholicism since the end of World War II. So that's really what we're going to be covering today. So as I said, the man who just took the name Pope Leo XIV, and he is taking this name after Leo XIII. And this man is an American cardinal, and he actually has a dual American and Peruvian citizenship, but he was born in the US of A, and he was raised in Chicago. This man by the name of Cardinal Robert Prevost. and he was a member of the Augustinians and even the prior of the Augustinians at one point. So he's from the religious orders, just how Pope Francis was from the Jesuit order. He was from the order of the Society of Jesus, commonly known as the Jesuits. This particular cardinal who was elected pope was the prior, the leader of the Augustinians. So he comes from the Augustinian tradition. And he was a favorite of Pope Francis, or at least favored by him. And we know this because Pope Francis appointed him as the prefect for the dicastery of bishops. And you go, okay, well, what is the prefect for the dicastery of bishops? Now, if you understand the process of getting the choosing of new bishops in Roman Catholicism, the history of this, as the history of Roman Catholicism has progressed more and more into the modern age, the process of nominating and selecting bishops has been more and more centralized in the Vatican. Now, if you go back to the Middle Ages and even earlier, there were times where the bishops could be chosen by the king of that particular country, or the local priests in that area may have nominated their bishops. But as time has went on and the code of canon law has gotten more and more centralized, the Vatican has to give the rubber stamp. They really pick and choose and rubber stamp every single Roman Catholic bishop around the world. So the process has gotten more and more centralized as time has gone on, and that's all written in their code of canon law. Now, the prefect for the dicastery of bishops is essentially the person who approves all of who nominates and approves all the bishops around the world. So that's an extremely powerful position. And that's a really important detail for us today because it allows us to glean into the fact that this guy was a Vatican insider. This man was somebody who was favored by Pope Francis, and he was favored by the insiders in the Vatican, such as the Vatican Curia. And the Curia is the administrative council or leadership of the Vatican under the Pope, who really is in charge of running everything. So this man was given an extremely powerful position, and that also explains why he was elected as quickly as he was. I believe it was on the fourth ballot, I believe. Now, modern conclaves, modern elections have typically been much shorter than the longer ones of ages past. And the common belief is that the reason why the Cardinals want to have a quick of a conclave as possible is because it shows unity in the Roman Catholic Church. But this man, Robert Prevost, was a man who the Cardinals were able to form a majority around this man relatively quickly. So those two details are very important. Is that this man who has become Pope Leo XIV is somebody who was favored by the insiders in the Vatican, and also that this was a man who really was somebody who was favored by Pope Francis, and that gives us some insight that he may, at least in some respects, continue on the trajectory of Pope Francis. Now, I listen to a lot of commentators, Roman Catholic commentators, or other news sources, traditionalist Roman Catholics, just trying to get different perspective, get different views on what people think of this guy. Some have called him a progressive, and some have called him a moderate. And like I said, that he was an Augustinian, that he spent a lot of time in Peru. He was the Archbishop of Chicalo. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, so bear with me if I'm mispronouncing it. But that is in Peru. He was the Archbishop there. And we know that Peru is a nation in South America. Once again, there's a liberation theology comes from Latin America, and that there's a strong presence of socialism and communism and leftward views in South America. And this guy, he does seem to be leaning more on the progressive side versus the traditionalist side. He really has he has used the same rhetoric as Pope Francis for calling for a quote more inclusive church. He's given statements, public statements, where he's expressed very pro-immigration views in the United States, and he's denounced guys like Donald Trump and J.D. Vance for their opposition to illegal immigration. He said I'm paraphrasing what he said to some extent, but he's given statements where he has said that these men have been uncompassionate, they have been harsh in their views of keeping people out of the country. And so when you hear that, it does very much sound like Pope Francis in many ways. And he's also, his environmental views seem to have a leftward trajectory. Now, some people have called him a moderate because he has expressed some doctrinal views that would be considered more traditional or conservative. For example, his views on abortion are very much what has been the traditional norm in Roman Catholicism. He has not expressed anything that would resemble a condoning of abortion. He's been very traditional on that front. And the same is true for his views on LGBTQ. His statements have been pretty standard in terms of not condoning that. He's been pretty strong in his uh, disapproval, condemnation of that, saying that's sin. He hasn't really opened the floodgates for that. Now, it's interesting, I'll say on this point, though, even though he's made some statements along those lines, Father James Martin, who is an American Jesuit who has really championed the rights of the LGBTQ in the United States, he said that he would love to have this man, Cardinal Robert Prevost, as Pope. So that tells you that if this guy who's this Jesuit has really promoted the rights of homosexuality in the United States, wants this guy to be Pope, he really can't be. That makes you wonder what's going on there behind the scenes at the very least. But I digress. And then he's also expressed an opposition to a broader role for women, such as he's opposed the idea of women deacons. Some have hoped, some within Roman Catholicism, some liberals have hoped that women deacons would eventually give way. That would lead to women priests, and then who knows what would follow after that. But Robert Prevost is very traditional on his roles of males in the priesthood and the diaconate. So that's just a kind of a summary of his theological views. So like I said, some have called him a progressive, some have called him more of a moderate. And you can see why when you look at some of the different views, there depending on what statements you're looking at, both of those can be kind of true. Both can be kind of within the flavor of what he has said in the past. So we really don't know specifically really how much he's going to emphasize what views. He's still kind of somewhat of a wild card in that sense. And that's why I really want to talk about today. Really, if we want to understand the future of where the Roman Catholic Church is going, which I think is very important, because I think it's going to have a big effect on the future of the history of the whole world. So even if you're not a Roman Catholic, I think that this is still something that's going to be very important. We really need to look at the big picture beyond just this man's views. And that's what a lot of news outlets are giving you. They're giving you, okay, this is what he said in the past, and it's very surface level. And there's nothing wrong with that. But then it leaves a lot to desire if you really want to glean into the future. Now, the last thing I want to say about Cardinal, now Pope Leo XIV, Robert Prevost, is that there have been allegations that he has covered up um, for priests who have committed sexual abuse and for children or for minors. And the organization SNAP, so that's the Survivors Network from Abuse of Priests, that's the acronym SNAP. This organization has reported to the Vatican, they have made allegations that when Prevost was the Archbishop of Chicalo in Peru, that he was very active in covering up for guilty priests. Now, I will say at this point that that has been denied by the Roman Catholic authorities in Peru and also by the Vatican. They deny that very vigorously, so you can decide what you want to think about that, but I wanted to list that information. That was listed even on some very mainstream sites, even just the Wikipedia article. And I know Wikipedia is not a first-rate source, but these allegations are no secret. That's what I'm trying to say, and that he has been there's been allegations made against this man on that particular point. Now, the only thing I'll say upon that on this point, I'm not going to talk too much about the sexual abuse scandal just because we're on YouTube and there's censorship. But I will say this, is that anybody who's studied the issue of the abuse crisis within the Roman Catholic Church, and I've read a few books on this topic, it's dark, it's very dark stuff, but it is the one thing I will say on this is that it is far more prevalent than people realize, and that there have been very credible sources, journalists, what have you, that say it is far more than a few bad apples. It is something that is extremely widespread and it is institutionalized. Now, does it go all the way up to the Vatican? I will let you make your determinations, but it is far more prevalent than many of us would like to believe. So that is really the summary of the man who has become Pope Leo XIV. Cardinal Robert Prevost is now Pope Leo XIV. Now the question really becomes, the question is, what will this man do as Pope? What is going to be the future for the trajectory of the Vatican? And that is the question that we want to try to answer today. So I'm going to give, as I have said, I'm going to give this summary of the history of the Vatican from the end of World War II, and I want to tell this story. It's a very fascinating story, actually, and it will paint the future. And then when I get to the end, I'm going to give my predictions for the future trajectory of the Roman Catholic Church, and by extension, the world. And I'll even give a few brief comments about how I think this is going to tie in to Bible prophecy. So here goes. So when we look at who the Pope was during World War II, it was Pope Pius XII, who was elected on the eve of World War II. So right before World War II started, he was this man Eugenio Pacelli, and he was part of the Vatican. He was part of the the Vatican black nobility, and his family was a family. They had been famously canon lay law lawyers, so they were not priests. His father and his grandfather were canon law lawyers. That's why they're called lay lawyers, because they weren't priests. And they served in the Vatican. They were very close to the popes. And Eugenio Pacelli, he was really a favorite of Pope Pius XI, and he was given a very high position in the Vatican, and he was the one who, before he became Pope, when he was serving in the Vatican diplomatic service, he was the one who was instrumental in arranging the Concordat, that's a Vatican diplomatic treaty, with Nazi Germany. So they made this alliance with Nazi Germany. They made an alliance with fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini. That's called the Lateran Treaty, and that really secured the country of Vatican City that we know today. It's the smallest country in the world. So they signed the Lateran Treaty with fascist Italy in 1929, and then they signed this Concordat with Nazi Germany in 1933. And so what happened was, even though the modern revisionism has tried to move Roman Catholicism, they've tried to downplay the Nazi alliance for Roman Catholicism, it was in fact a reality. During World War II, the Vatican was aligned with fascism and with Nazism, and that was what was going on, and that Pope Pius XII, he had a hatred of communism that followed him all throughout his life. And when he was the nuncio in Germany, he actually had an incident where socialists and communists actually broke into his apostolic residence in Germany, and he actually had a pretty scary encounter with these socialists who almost killed him, and he actually had nightmares about it throughout his life. So he hated communism, Pacelli, and when he became pope, he was during World War II, he was rooting for the Nazis to win, particularly in the East. He wanted the defeat of the Soviet Union, and that if those who understand the visions of Fatima, how people these are supposed to be prophecies or visions given from Mary, and it said that they were given to these three children in Portugal. And one of the things that Mary is supposed to have said, she said that Russia needs to be consecrated to her heart, or in other words, that Russia needs to be converted to Roman Catholicism. So now the reason I'm bringing this up is because when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. That's what Pacelli did. He did this ceremony, this ritual where he consecrated Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary, and that he was hoping that the advance of the Axis forces into the Soviet Union, he was hoping they were going to complete the conquest of the Soviet Union, that atheistic communism was going to collapse, and that this was going to pave the way for the expansion of Roman Catholicism into the Eastern lands that had historically been Eastern Orthodox even before the rise of communism. This is the history. That's what Pacelli wanted to happen. Now, as the Allies started to win the war, they shifted gears, and obviously, even as early as 1943, they were already starting to make diplomatic overtures to the United States. Because once we get to the Cold War period, we know that the Axis are defeated in 1945. At that point, because Pope Pius XII was Pope from 1939 to 1958. So then we have, so the early stages of the Cold War, the Vatican under Pope Pius XII was aligned with with the with the United States, and they were opposed to the Soviet Union. And what we need to understand in this story is that that the Soviet Union and the United States were both vying for influence over the Catholic Church. And that these guys would even try to align the CIA and the KGB during the Cold War period. And this probably is still going on today, even though we just don't have documentation of it. Is that these agencies were trying to recruit cardinals to their side. They were trying to create factions and ultimately to get their own popes elected. Now, after the death of Pope Pius XII, the man who was elected as Pope was Angelo Roncalli, and he took the name Pope John the 23rd, which some of the traditionalist conservative Catholics took note of, that he took a name after an anti-pope. Now, and there are many traditional Roman Catholics who believe that he was not the rightful winner of the conclave in 1958. They actually, if you have ever heard of what's called the Siri thesis, Cardinal Giuseppe Siri, who was supposed to be a traditionalist, a conservative, there are traditionalist Roman Catholics today who believe that he was the one who won, and that white smoke went up, and they thought, oh, we had a pope earlier than they did, and there's even footage of this at the chimney. And then they believe that essentially that the liberal faction, that there was a bait and switch, and that Roncalli was then he essentially stole the election. That's what the traditionalists believe. Now, regardless of actually what happened in the 1958 conclave, Roncalli was elected, and he was left leaning, and that the Soviet Union and the KGB, and even Stalin before his death in 1953, so this is before Roncalli got elected, the Soviet Union wanted Roncalli. That's what I'm trying to say. And because he was more of a left leaning, they wanted to shift the Roman Catholic Church leftward, and that's something that we're going to see in this story, is that the changes that have happened within Roman Catholicism since the death of Pope Pius XII have all been intentional. And one of the key players in this story is going to be the Jesuits. But what happened is that Roncalli, because he was a left-leaning pope, he really broke away the Vatican broke away that alliance with the United States, and they really started to align themselves more with the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union. And that continued, John the 23rd, and then that continued later under Pope Paul VI. So here we have these two popes, and they start the Second Vatican Council. And the Second Vatican Council brought major changes to Roman Catholicism. It was started under Pope John the 23rd in 1962, but then he dies, and then Pope Paul VI is elected in 1963. And then the council goes from 1962 to 1965. So there's this 3-year period, and this is the start of the ecumenical movement. They said, we're not going to call Protestants and other Christians heretics anymore. We're going to call them separated brethren. And then the other thing that happened is that they said they changed the liturgy. And then by 1969, the Latin Mass was actually forbidden. So there were major shifts within Roman Catholicism. And even today, the traditionalists really want to go back to a pre-Vatican II Catholicism. That's what the traditionalist Catholics want, while the progressives will really want to continue this revolution forward. And that's going to really become important as we get into the modern day. So Giovanni Montini, who became Pope Paul VI, he really continued this revolution. And then by the time we get to 1969, the Latin Mass, the Mass had always been said in Latin. That was now forbidden, and it was now essentially mandatory that the new Mass, called the Novus Ordo Mass in the vernacular languages, is what had to be performed. So that's essentially what happened. Now, when we get to 1978, we have this pope called John Paul I who's elected, and he's only pope for around 30 days. It's either 31 days or 33 days, I forget. I think it's 31 days that he's pope. And 1978 has been called the year of three popes because Pope Paul VI died, and then we have Pope John Paul I for 31 days, and then we get Pope John Paul II. Now, John Paul I is a fascinating character in this study now because he died under extremely suspicious circumstances, and it is very credible, in my opinion, that it has been, even though it's denied by mainstream historians, that he was murdered. And that he was murdered really for two reasons: that he discovered how widespread Freemasonry was within the walls of the Vatican, within the hierarchy of the Vatican, even within the Curia. He was given a dossier exposing the Masonic cardinals and bishops within his ranks. And the other thing is that he pledged to clean up the Vatican Bank. And the Vatican Bank, once again, had ties to this Masonic lodge called P2. And the archbishop who ran the Vatican Bank, named by the name of Paul Marcinkus, he had ties to this banker called Roberto Calvi. Roberto Calvi was a member of this Masonic lodge, P2. And Roberto Calvi, he was later found dead in London, hanged from this bridge in London called the Blackfriars Bridge, and he had bricks in his pocket. So the Masonic symbolism of his death, that Scotland Yard deemed a suicide, that it's pretty clear that he was killed by somebody in very Masonic, a very Masonic-like ritual. That the Masonic symbolism surrounding his death is prevalent for everybody to see. But Pope John Paul I, he essentially discovered the darkness within the Vatican. He discovered it, and that he wanted to expose it, and he was murdered for it. And there's been some very good books on this. A great book called In God's Name by David Yallop. You should look up that book. That's an outstanding book on the murder of John Paul I. Now, if you want to go back to what I said about Pope Pius XII and his alliance with Nazi Germany, I'd recommend the book Hitler's Pope by John Cornwell. These are very, very good historical books that are not widely read today on Rome, on Romanism, so I'd highly recommend those books. So this is something in the story that we need to understand, is that today that there is a spiritual darkness within the Vatican. And that I am a historicist. I think that Rome is at the center of what is called Mystery Babylon in the book of Revelation. When I look at Antichrist from the historical Protestant view, I look to the Vatican, the papacy, to Rome, to the popes of Rome. I think it's the dynasty of Antichrist. And this was the view held by guys such as Charles Spurgeon or the Puritans or Calvin and Luther. And I think that this spiritual darkness, even though it has more or less been there for centuries, it has become much more pronounced in the 20th and the 21st century. And we need to understand that. Today, the Vatican is run by the Jesuits. The Jesuits are the power behind the throne, and they really consolidated their iron grip on the Vatican when Pope Francis got elected. We're going to get to that in a second. But because we're at John Paul I here, and he discovered all this Freemasonry within the Vatican, I also want to point out that the other thing is that there is Satanism in the Vatican. People know that when you get to the highest levels of Masonry, it essentially is Luciferianism or Satanism, whatever word you want to use. But another man who exposed the deep spiritual evil within the walls of the Vatican was Malachi Martin. Now, if you've never heard of Malachi Martin, he is really the ultimate Vatican insider. He was a member of the Jesuits and he left them. He worked on the Dead Sea Scrolls. He was assistant to Cardinal Augustin Bea, who was a Jesuit cardinal and a Freemason, ironically. But eventually, what happened is Malachi Martin, regardless of what you believe about him, because he was a highly controversial figure, and I don't want to shy away from the truth about that, is that he was the ultimate Vatican insider. He had a deep knowledge of what was going on in the Vatican. He wrote a number of books. All of his books, I've read most of his books, and they're fascinating and at times disturbing, but fascinating. And one of the books he wrote is called Windswept House. This is one of two books I want to show today. And this book is what he called a faction. So it's a fictional novel that he said was 90% or more based on real history. And that in this book that he called a faction, because it's factual history is what he called it, he alleges that there was a satanic enthroning of Lucifer within the Vatican in 1963 under Pope Paul VI. And that it is his belief that the Satanists or the Luciferians have been trying to infiltrate the Vatican for a long, long time. And he believes that in the 20th century, they essentially completed this takeover. So whether you want to call it the Masons or the Illuminati or the Luciferians, whatever terms you want to use, Malachi Martin said that they conducted a ritual within the Vatican in 1963 where they, in this occult ritual, enthroned Lucifer in the Vatican. And there's even a quote by Pope Paul VI, which is kind of vague and ominous, but he said that the smoke of Satan had entered into the Vatican. You can look up that quote by Pope Paul VI. Now, skeptics say that he was not speaking literally, it's kind of allegorical, but I am personally believing that Pope Paul VI was alluding to this very thing. That's what I believe. Now, Malachi Martin was somebody who was trying to expose it, and even at the end of his life, it said that he was writing the nonfiction version of Windswept House. That's one of the things that I've read in my research on him. I want to just read a little quote here. This is just a small paragraph from his book, Windswept House. This is on page 7, and it says here the year 1963. Now, in this early chapter, it's titled History as Prologue to the novel. And this is what Malachi Martin says. He says, the enthronement of the fallen archangel Lucifer was effected within the Roman Catholic citadel on June 29, 1963, a fitting date for a historic promise to be fulfilled. As the principal agents of this ceremonial well knew, Satanist tradition had long predicted that the time of the prince would be ushered in at the moment when a pope would take the name of the Apostle Paul. That's referring to Pope Paul VI. That requirement, the signal that the availing time had begun, had been accomplished just 8 days before with the election of the latest Peter in the line. There had barely been time since the papal conclave had ended for the complex arrangements to be ready, but the Supreme Tribunal had decided that there would be no more perfect date for the enthronement of the prince than this feast day of the twin princes of the citadel, SS Peter and Paul, and no more perfect place than the chapel of St. Paul itself, situated as it was so near to the apostolic palace. So you can make of that as you will, and you can, if you want to, you can get a copy of Windswept House, and you can read what the entire book that he wrote in its context, because I'm reading it somewhat out of context. And also, if you understand Malachi Martin, he said very straightforwardly he went on to the Art Bell show a number of times, and he was explicit that Luciferianism had entered into the walls of the Vatican. So that's very, very important. Excuse me. So that is really the context of what Pope John Paul I discovered, but he was killed after 31 days by poisoning. And once again, you should read the book In God's Name by David Yallop, an excellent book where he really went to great lengths to prove and document this, and he gets into things such as the lack of the autopsy and the strange circumstances of what occurred following the Pope's death, even the sealing off of his apartments and all the papal apartments and all the rest of it. But then what happened next is, so the cardinals all go back to another conclave, and what they did was they elected Pope John Paul II. Now, Pope John Paul II is he realigned himself with the West and with the United States in one sense, but he was a globalist. So he opposed in many ways the policies of the Soviet Union, and this is the time period in history where the Roman Catholic solidarity movement in Poland took place, and that had connections to the Central Intelligence Agency. And so Pope John Paul II supported the solidarity movement in the 1980s in Poland. So that shows that he really aligned himself more with the West, where John the 23rd and Pope Paul VI had been more aligned with the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union. But he, once again, I would say he was not a freedom fighter in the sense, he was a globalist. And what we need to understand is that Pope John Paul II was what has been called the rock star pope. He was this pope. He traveled all over the world. He really set a lot of trends for modern popes. And that everywhere he went, he was met by adoring crowds. And that's why he's been called the rock star pope. And that one of the things that he did is that he promoted the interfaith movement. This is an important detail. He promoted the interfaith movement really more than any pope before him. The ecumenical movement really got started in the 1960s following Vatican II. Now, the ecumenical movement is the movement to join all the Christian denominations together. And the interfaith movement is the cousin of the ecumenical movement, and that's to bring all the religions together. And this is the goal of the New World Order. And that Pope John Paul II was really the prophet for the interfaith movement. He really was. He was the false prophet of the interfaith movement. And this is something that we need to understand, because he was really instrumental in giving this movement more momentum than it ever had. And really, the popes that follow him have tried to build on that momentum. The great example of that will be Pope Francis when we get to him. But Pope John Paul II, who is now been canonized as a saint in the Roman Catholic Church, that he went to great lengths to advance this movement. Now, the best example of this is that in 1986, he had this giant interfaith movement in Assisi, Italy, and that all the leaders of the world religions came, and you had all Christian denominations. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Anglican Communion, was there. Eastern Orthodox patriarchs were there, such as the Patriarch of Constantinople. And there's this famous imagery of this Eastern Orthodox patriarch and the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury walking up these steps together, the three of them, the three leaders of Christendom, the three largest branches of Christendom, Romanism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Anglicanism, walking together up these steps, praying for peace. And there were Muslims there, and Buddhists, and Sikhs, and Native Americans, and shamans, and voodoo witch doctors, and all the rest of it. They all came to this place, and they agreed. They lit a candle representing peace. They lifted all these prayers together for peace. It was a religious babel, a mixing of the world's religions. And this was such a momentous event that in 2016, Pope Francis did the exact same event again, commemorating the earlier one in 1986. So Pope John Paul II was a big forerunner in the interfaith movement. I think the interfaith movement is one of the biggest. It's one of the biggest movements in the world, one of the most important movements in the world for what is going to happen in the future, because the secret societies, the powers that be, they want to bring all the world's religions together under one world religion, and that is what they are working toward, and that is what John Paul II was the forerunner to. Now, after Pope John II, he had a very long pontificate until 2005. So now we're up to the 21st century. That there was elements within the Vatican. There was at this point I want to mention this book. This is another highly controversial book, but it's also a bestseller. It was a New York Times bestseller, if I'm not mistaken. This book is called In the Closet of the Vatican: Power, Homosexuality, and Hypocrisy. And this book talks about this was written by a French journalist who, if I'm not mistaken, is a homosexual himself, and he wanted to really show the prevalence of this. And he really says that this is prevalent even in the highest corridors of the Vatican in Rome. And one of the things he talks about in this book is what is called the St. Galen's Mafia. That there was this group of left-leaning cardinals who were working after the death of John Paul II. They were working very, very hard to get one of their members, one of their cardinals, to be the Pope. Now they wanted Carlo Maria Martini, who was a Jesuit cardinal. That was their man that they wanted to be Pope. Now, before Martini died, because Martini has now passed away. But that really didn't work, and they were disappointed with the appointment of Ratzinger, who was, in some respects, was more of a doctrinal conservative, and he even lifted the ban on the Latin Mass, and he lifted the excommunication on the Traditionalist Society of Pius X, the Society, the Society of St. Pius X, SSPX. So they were disappointed because Ratzinger was more conservative and was more traditional than they wanted. And there are many people who believe that Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, was pushed out and that he was under pressure, that there was pressure on him. And you can go back to some of the scandals of that time, such as what was called the Vatican leaks scandal, that Benedict XVI butler took sensitive documents and he leaked them to the Italian media, talking about things related to some of the scandals that have been going on in the Vatican, what have you. You can go back and look up that scandal called the Vatican leaks scandal on the internet. And this was something his Pope Benedict XVI's personal butler went to the media and leaked sensitive documents. And Vatican City it's an independent country. It's one of the most secretive places in the world. So this was a big story. But there are others who believe that there was even more sensitive stuff going on, that he was essentially pressured out or pushed out. We'll probably never know all the details of that, but that is true. So when this happened, this group, the St. Galen's Mafia, this left-leaning group that's talked about in this book and other books, the man who they wanted was Francis. And that's when Pope Francis got elected. Now you need to understand that Pope Francis was a Jesuit. The Jesuits are if you understand the history of the Jesuits, we've talked about the Jesuits a lot on this channel. They have gone it's in the 20th and 21st century, they became very, very left-leaning in the theology they espoused. They were really the architects of the Second Vatican Council through theologians like Karl Rahner and Henry Lubach or Cardinal Augustin Bea, who I mentioned earlier. They are the power behind the throne in the Vatican. And what they want to do is, because they're working for this one world religion, they understand that they have to pull down the old traditional Catholicism and they need to replace it with a more left-leaning, liberal, inclusive Catholicism. And so this group of cardinals, which had links to the Jesuits, the St. Galen's Mafia, they got Pope Francis in there. And this was who the Jesuits wanted. And that Pope Francis drastically shifted the Roman Catholic Church leftward in many ways. So he put the Latin Mass that the traditionalists love so much, he reinstituted the ban on it. He reversed those policies of Pope Benedict XVI, to the disappointment and even the anger of the traditionalist faction. And then Pope Francis called for a more inclusive church. That same rhetoric that the new Pope Leo XIV has given as a cardinal, that they wanted a more inclusive church. Famously, he was very ambiguous in how he talked about things in reference to gays and homosexuals. He said, "Who am I to judge?" Like I said before, in 2016, Pope Francis did the same Interfaith Movement event, promoting the Interfaith Movement. And in 2019, he had what was called the Amazon Synod. And he actually allowed locals, Amazonian locals, to come into the Vatican and give their traditional prayers and their songs in their dances, even in their traditional garb and their headdresses. This is syncretism, ladies and gentlemen. He really was a promoter of religious syncretism. And that goes back. That's been a Jesuit tactic for centuries. When you go back to even the days of Jesuit missionaries in India, like Francis Xavier, how they were or the same thing in South America, whenever the Jesuits were missionaries in other lands, they would say, hey, keep your old gods, keep your own customs and practices, just accept our Roman Catholic theology and just merge them together, syncretism. Pope Francis was a big promoter of that. Now, in one of his trips, he went to Iraq and he prayed in front of this ancient Sumerian ziggurat. So he's in the land of ancient Babylon, the papal antichrist, if you understand what I'm saying, in the land of Babylon, and he led an interfaith prayer service. So this man was a false prophet. There's just no doubt about it. He was a false prophet. He was promoting a theology that all religions lead to God. Um, this is deception. This is theology that leads millions of people into hell. Um, I know, forgive me I know what to some my rhetoric may be harsh, but it's not. This is the truth. This is what Pope Francis was promoting. And this is the trajectory that we need to understand, is that this is what Pope Francis was doing, was that he was drastically shifting the Roman Catholic Church in a more liberal direction, a more left-leaning direction. His views on the Amazon Synod that I just mentioned was promoting uh, radical environmentalism, talking about things like global warming. This man was a promoter of globalism, of socialism, and communism. He came from South America, liberation theology. Um, and like I said, a big promoter of the interfaith movement. The interfaith service I talked about in Iraq, that was a big event, the Amazon Synod. He also had what was called the Synod on Synodality, which once again was continuing the leftward trajectory of the Vatican and the Roman Catholic Church. The Jesuits worked very hard to get their man installed into the papacy, and they worked very hard to change, just as they have worked very hard to infiltrate the evangelical and Protestant denominations and bring them down and lead them into apostasy. I believe that they are behind the promoting of liberal theology in the Protestant denominations. They are doing the exact same thing, trying to eradicate the traditional Roman Catholic theology and replace it with this more liberal, left-leaning Roman Catholic theology. Because ultimately, you say, well, why would they be doing this if they're Roman Catholic priests? They want the New World religion, and they understand liberalism is like the glue. They understand if you're going to get a bunch of religions to merge together, you have to get them to be willing to get rid of and eject all of their various distinctives. If Protestants have certain distinctives, or even you take Muslims or Buddhists or Hindus, they have all their religious doctrines that contradict. So how do you get all these religions to merge together? You have to get them to find some type of a common ground. You need a glue. You need something to glue them together, and you have to get them to eject all the things that are keeping them apart. That's what the liberal worldview is. That is the glue that they are using to merge it all together. Can't we all just come together and be tolerant? This is what the Bible talks about, the prophets who say peace, peace when there is no peace. That is the interfaith movement. So now we have this man Prevost, Robert Prevost, who is now Pope Leo XIV. And I do believe that he is going to be a progressive. He is going to continue. I think he will more or less be a continuation of the Pope Francis papacy. Now, it may be in a different flavor. It may be more subtle than Francis. He may at times appear to be more traditional or more conservative or more moderate. We have to wait and see. I don't know. But I think that even his name of taking Leo the 13th, Leo the 13th was a champion of workers. Even the term social justice really goes back to Pope Leo the 13th and the Jesuits of the 1800s, guys like Taparelli. This is his taking the name of Leo the 14th, talking about the modern Pope. That would seem that he is going to be a promoter of workers' rights and social justice. And that is really code word for socialism and communist rhetoric and globalist rhetoric. So that is really where we are at, guys. I know I've given a lot of information in this video. I knew this was going to be a slightly longer video, but I think all of this information is really important. So I'm going to finish off today by giving my predictions for the future, and then we're going to really be done. Now, I believe that we are at the point in history where I think that Rome, the papacy, is Mystery Babylon. I've said this in my videos again and again and again and again. And I think that we are in the point of its decline and eventually its final collapse and destruction. And I think these things are prophesied in the book of Revelation. And once again, I interpret the book of Revelation according to the historicist method of Bible prophecy. Now, what I think is happening is that the nations, I think the seventh vial that destroys all this is the Battle of Armageddon. This is the vial that is poured out on the air in Revelation 16. And prior to this battle, it talks about how the nations are brought together religiously, socially, politically, economically. That's the times we're living in right now. And I'll just read this really quick. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because I did 8 videos on the book of Revelation, so you can go back and listen to all of that. I gave all this in some detail, but I just want to give the context here really quick where it talks about the spirit. This is verse 14 where it says, verse 13 and 14, I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are the spirits of devils working miracles, which go forth to the kings of the earth and the whole world to gather them to the battle of the great day of God Almighty. Now, like I said, I'm not going to get into a whole bunch of context on that right now. You can go back and watch my videos on the book of Revelation about that. But this is what I'll say, guys. I think we're at a time where these demonic spirits are gathering the kings of the earth and the whole world together for that battle that's going to happen in the future. That's what I think is happening right now. And I think that when you read verses like 1 Timothy 4, how these spirits are called seducing spirits, and the things the Bible talks about how these spirits lie to us, and it talks about the doctrines of devils. And many of these false prophets and false teachers in the Christian church are promoting literally the doctrines of demons. And I think that the Interfaith Movement and the New Age movement are the big movement. I think the 3 movements that I see bringing the world together more than any other movements is the Interfaith Movement, to bring all the world's religions together. I think the New Age movement is going to be more and more prominent in the future. And then I think socialism and communism, and I would even globalism, is kind of those political movements. Those are the movements bringing the world together, once again, religiously, socially, politically, economically. So here are all of that being said, I know that's a lot, but these are my predictions for the papacy of Pope Leo XIV and for the Vatican, and by extension for the whole world. Now, the first thing is I do think that he is going to be a globalist, and I think the leftward trajectory of the Vatican is more or less going to continue on. I think he will essentially be a continuation of Pope Francis. Now, like I said, he may have a different flavor to him. He may at times appear to be more conservative, but I think more or less, as I said at the beginning of the video, I think he is an insider. I think he is somebody who was picked by the cardinals who are favorable to Francis, and we know that Francis stacked the College of Cardinals with progressives in line with his vision. I think he is an insider. I think he is a continuation of that policy. And so I think that the globalism, the leftward rhetoric, the socialism, communism, even though they don't always come out and say it in so many words, I think that trajectory is going to continue. That's my first prediction. Now, my second prediction is that the interfaith movement will be promoted by the new pope, and that now, whether with this pope or a successor pope, at some point, I think that the interfaith movement is actually going to increase in its intensity and it is going to become more successful. And I think that the two religions they want to merge together more than anything else is Roman Catholicism and Islam. That there is a big movement to bring them together, and both of those, and communism, they're trying to use communism as kind of a glue between these religions, and that's a whole video for another day. But if you understand, there has been an alliance between communism and Islam that's been called the Red Green Axis, and there's just been promotion of the interfaith movement not only by popes but even in places in the Middle East like Dubai and all the rest of it. They're creating Chrislam. That is going to all continue, and I think that the interfaith movement is even going to pick up intensity. Now, my third prediction, this is probably the one that may be the hardest to verify, but I think that the New Age movement, the teachings of the New Age movement are going to continue, and I think they are going to gain more prominence both within Roman Catholicism and in other Christian denominations. And that has already started in many charismatic denominations, in many sections of the charismatic movement. There has been an infiltration of New Age teachings into the charismatic church. I think that that is going to continue on in all of the Christian denominations, including Rome, because I think that the New Age movement is the outward face of the secret esoteric religion of the secret societies. That's the secret Illuminati religion being spread to the masses. That's what Alice Bailey talked about in her book, The Externalization of the Hierarchy. That book is always such a mouthful to pronounce. But I think the New Age is going to become more prominent. So I said that the interfaith movement's going to pick up steam. The globalist leftward trajectory in the Vatican is going to continue to pick up steam. The New Age movement is going to continue to pick up steam. And then my fourth and final prediction is under the pontificates of Benedict XVI and Pope Francis, the Vatican has actually been developing theology for the acceptance of ETs, extraterrestrials, aliens. And even though that is considered very fringe by some people, there have been Jesuit theologians like Guy Consolmagno who have written books called Is the Extraterrestrial My Brother? Pope Francis said that he would baptize an extraterrestrial. I think that they are going to continue to develop that theology, and they may play a very central part in the quote disclosure movement. Now, if you've watched my videos on the UFO phenomenon, I do believe the phenomenon is real. I think what are called the gray aliens are real beings, but I do not believe they are extraterrestrials. I do not believe they are from outer space. I think that is a great demonic deception. I think they are spiritual beings, interdimensional beings, and that there is a demonic component to them. I believe they are under Satan's kingdom, under the authority of Satan, whether they are literally demons or not. I am perfectly content to say they are probably separate from our traditional understanding of demons, but that they are still a part of Satan's kingdom. Now, I think that this ET space brother deception is a big deception that's being thrust upon the world, and I do believe that the Vatican is going to continue to play a role in this quote disclosure movement. So those are my four predictions. And really the only thing I did with these predictions is I have said the things that have been going on in the past are going to continue. When you look at the history of Vatican II, everything that I said, the leftward trajectory of the Vatican, that goes back all the way to Vatican II, all the way to the 1960s. Interfaith, New Age, same thing. And then the aliens thing, that's only started to pick up steam more recently. But all the predictions I've made, I've essentially, the only thing I've said, guys, is what's been going on in recent times in the past is simply going to continue on in the future. So it's just based on study. These are my predictions. I think it'll be interesting to see how accurate or inaccurate they are. But I do think that the nations are coming together. I think they're going to continue to come together until God judges it, which is going to happen at some point in the future. And I think that the Vatican is going to play a central role in all this. And that is why the pontificate of Leo XIV is an event in history that we need to be paying attention to. So I appreciate everybody who stayed with me for the full hour. I know this was a little bit of a longer video, but I do really believe that this information is really important for the future. So I'm really glad for all of you who are willing to stick with me through the video. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. Subscribe to the channel. I thank you to everybody who has been supporting the channel in recent weeks and months. We are growing, so there is more exciting stuff coming up with Reformed Truther Ministries. So stay tuned, as we're going to be getting back out into the field. We're going to be continuing to research cryptids, the paranormal, the Nephilim from a Christian perspective. That is the main emphasis of this channel. So thanks everybody for staying tuned. A lot of great stuff coming up next. So this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries. Thanks everybody. If you enjoyed this video, then check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.